And so, hi everyone. I'm Catherine, the Outreach and Engagement Manager at the Organization for Competitive Markets, and I wanted to welcome you to this year's third Ag Justice webinar. Our Ag Justice webinars are a benefit for OCM members, and we take this opportunity to connect you with experts from the movement for anti-independent agriculture. Some of our closest partners for the year have been the folks over at Open Market Institute. OMI is a think tank dedicated to reforming U.S. antitrust policy to reestablish competitive markets. They released a report earlier this year called Food and Power, Addressing Monopolization in America's Food System. If you haven't yet, be sure to check it out. So from OMI, we're really excited to welcome Claire Kelloway today. Claire Kelloway is a reporter and researcher at OMI. She's the primary writer for Food and Power, a first-of-its-kind website providing original reporting and resources on monopoly power and economic concentration in the food systems. Her writing on food and agriculture has appeared in Washington Monthly, ProPublica, Civil Eat, and more. Just for logistics, we'll be muting everyone during the presentation so that you can hear Claire clearly. And so take note of your questions, hold them for the Q&A after the presentation, and you'll have time to ask questions then. And so thanks for attending, and I'll turn it over to Claire now.
Great. Thank you for that introduction, Catherine, and thanks to everyone who's here on the live call and everyone who will maybe be watching afterwards. Excited to be here. Really appreciate OCM's leadership on this issue. I've definitely learned a lot of what I know from you guys, so I'm very excited to be here. As you know, Catherine said, went too far. I work for the Open Markets Institute. We are a think tank based in DC that focuses on issues of consolidation throughout the entire economy. I focus on food and agriculture. Definitely keeps me busy, studying everything from, concentration in inputs all the way to retail markets, really looking at consolidation across the entire food chain. But I guess first I want to start, more broadly, why do we have an entire think tank dedicated to this issue of consolidation? Why should we care about this? I think, consolidation is really a fundamental question about our political economy and how we want to structure our markets and who has power in these markets. And unfortunately, something we've seen over the past 30, 40 years especially is this dramatic increase in consolidation across almost every industry. These are a few charts just showing a sampling of the top market share of a few of these companies, but really this has dramatic effects on all sorts of things. You look at something like healthcare. Healthcare is a major issue. It's increasingly, a growing cost, and a lot of that has to do with consolidation of hospitals, of pharmaceutical companies, of manufacturers of medical devices. You look at something like dialysis, where two firms control 92% of the market, and a recent report by NPR said this means that these companies can charge simply what they can get away with. This really affects our basic ability to afford healthcare. Another issue is entrepreneurship more broadly. You look at small businesses. We know that small businesses create more jobs, I guess per capita or per business, given their size. And there's this whole myth or mythology that we live in a time of Silicon Valley and startups. A lot of my peers are really interested in getting into tech and creating startups. At the same time, small business formation is actually at a historic low. The number of new businesses launched every year is half of what it was in the 70s, and that's only been declining. Small business formation is down 25% from pre-recession levels. And also, just the nature of entrepreneurship has fundamentally changed in the way that businesses are not necessarily looking to, create something that's going to last many generations as an independent business. Often the way funding is acquired is on the promise of getting acquired. The end game is increasingly acquisition. Or the funding for new businesses themselves are coming from the dominant players, again, with the potential that they'll get acquired. And all of, this talk of entrepreneurship is nothing to say of this new rise of dominant tech companies that are really fundamentally changing things like our retail landscape in the case of Amazon, and also our fundamental media and information systems that are critical tools of democracy, but are increasingly dominated by companies like Google and Facebook, posing really existential threats to our elections and the nature of discourse itself. And so, needless to say, I think this is a pretty big problem. And I think it's important to know that the economy hasn't always been this way. A lot of these changes have, again, there was a dramatic shift around the 70s or 80s to see the increased levels of mergers and consolidation that we have today. That's partially because we've stopped enforcing laws that were put in place the first time we took on monopolies and corporate power. Because, as probably some of you are familiar with, around the turn of the century, there was similar issues with dominant railroad companies and Standard Oil, and of course, consolidated meat packers that led to the first anti-monopoly movement, which was led by farmers and workers, that really pushed Congress to pass bills like the Sherman Act and then its amendments, the Clayton Act, and also something you all are very familiar with, the Packers and Stockyards Act. These laws tried to break up some of these large companies and also manage anti-competitive practices that can happen when a company becomes too dominant. In the intervening years, since that first sort of turn of the century movement, lawmakers continued to try and strengthen antitrust laws and build upon them with things like the Robinson and Patman Act, which addressed predatory pricing, an issue that we see today with retailers selling products below cost with the intent to drive out competition. We also saw changes in enforcement at agencies like the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission. There were much more heavily scrutinized mergers. It was much harder to get a merger passed, and also government enforcers led more lawsuits against predatory practices, anti-competitive behavior, and against large companies. Even, well into the 70s, we saw large breakups like AT&T. And so the question is, how did things change? Even as something like the breakup of AT&T was being litigated, there were widespread changes in how we thought about antitrust enforcement that primarily grew out of the University of Chicago and this broader economic change of thought called the Chicago School of Economics. Thinkers in this camp really affected all aspects of the economy, but certainly we saw a really profound change in antitrust laws with thinkers like Robert Bork and its Consumer Welfare Standard, that in his book, The Antitrust Paradox, that really shifted the main goal of antitrust law from looking at market structure and questions of power to how will a merger affect consumers. Specifically, will a merger increase prices? This made it so that really the only way to block a merger would be if you could prove that it was going to raise prices for consumers. And this overlooked really critical questions like how will a merger impact workers? Or how will a merger impact even bigger issues of competition? How will it impact variety and resilience of regional economies? And really, the consumer welfare standard sometimes even fails on its own merits. You know, we see today it hasn't always prevented increases in consumer prices. You look at an industry like seeds, where definitely prices are increasing. And that's because the ideology fundamentally favors bigness, because when you're assessing a merger, companies can say, you know, this merger is going to create efficiencies or economies of scale that will drive down prices, even if this isn't going to be the case. But, you know, again, the favoring of bigness and efficiencies makes mergers very permissive, and we've seen historic increases in the number of mergers that are approved, to the point where today the meatpacking industry, for instance, is more consolidated than it was when the Packers and Stockyard Act was passed. And farmers in particular feel the impact of this consolidation across the entire economy. So again, this is something that I'm sure you all are very familiar with, but the basic gist is a continuous theme of farmers and workers being squeezed in this system, in which you have sort of bottlenecks at many points in the chain that are becoming more large and powerful, and they have rights to coordinate so long as they legally merge, versus many small players that can at times struggle to coordinate and work together to build power against these large entities that are on the one hand increasing prices that farmers pay for basic inputs, but also squeezing farmers to receive less and less for their products. So starting with something like inputs, we see that farm equipment is very consolidated, as is the market for seeds and crop protection. 3 companies sell 95% of large farm tractors in the U.S., with one company, John Deere, selling over half, 53%. In seeds, there have been some really startling mega mergers approved just in the past couple of years. I remember one antitrust scholar looking at the recent Bayer and Monsanto merger, you know, really saying, if this is approved, why do we even have antitrust laws? It's pretty startling, the amount of consolidation that's grown. Today, you know, when you combine the market share for crops and agrochemicals, 3 companies sell largely 75% of all those products. This has enormous consequences, not obviously on, you know, growing prices, but also declining variety. And this larger trend of corporations creating a greater dependence on sort of their universe of products and services, that's really, in some cases, changing the very notion of ownership. Tractors and farm equipment is a really great example. You know, in the past, the social contract was that at the point of sale, this product is yours, and equipment manufacturers relied on margins from the sale of new equipment to support their businesses. Now, they're not just selling you a tractor, they're selling this entire universe of services and equipment, and they really want to continue to make money past the point of sale into things like repairs. So now we see that the companies will say, well, you may have paid $500,000 for this tractor, but we still own the code inside that makes it run. So you cannot, you know, go in there to do a basic fix. You need to pay our technicians to come and fix this tractor for you. It's monopolized markets for repair, and yeah, made it so farmers have, you know, less ownership over their equipment. Similarly with seeds, we see seed companies saying, you know, you can use our seeds, but we technically own the genetics inside the seeds. We've patented that. So if your seed goes into someone else's farm, they can sue for, that plant growing unauthorized. We're also pairing seeds with specific chemical regimes, again, locking people into a greater universe of products and creating more dependency on their products. And meat packing, I think, this is one where I've learned pretty much everything I know about meat packing from OCM and different academics in you guys' orbit, so probably don't need to go too much into this, but suffice to say, again, meat packers are more powerful than they were when we passed the Packers and Stockyards Act, and this has had the effect of packers really controlling, critical factors of farmers' success, and oh, sorry, the lights went off. Really, at a basic level, dealing with the decline of even just the notion of there being competitive markets. I mean, to your guys' name, there are no, free, open, competitive markets in the livestock industry. The way that these meat packers exert their power looks, slightly different in every industry. You have something like poultry contracting, going back to this idea of ownership. Farmers no longer even own their livestock. They are contracting with a large company, which has, complete control over their factors of success and also determines the price they're paid at the end of raising these birds. You also have industries like beef that are, nominally not vertically integrated, and yet packers increasingly entering forward contracts and controlling a lot of the supply and actively manipulating the cash markets, the few that remain, to suppress the nominal price setting I forget what it's called. Anyway, the index, or the place where the price is found, the price discovery markets. And you don't need to take my word for it. In all of these industries, pork, beef, chicken, there are major price fixing suits. In beef, there's a suit, alleging that packers are manipulating cash markets for the purpose of suppressing prices paid to farmers. In pork and chicken, there are allegations that these companies are controlling the supply of this meat to increase the price to consumers, and also sharing data with each other about how much they're paying their contract farmers to suppress the prices that these farmers receive. And this has been devastating to rural communities and to the livestock industry. You'd look at something like the pork industry that changed really dramatically from a system where in the early 90s most pork was sold in competitive markets to today where these markets practically don't exist. And farmers are really at the mercy of these large packers that increasingly want to work with larger and larger farms, and the number of hog farmers has declined dramatically. I believe upwards of 80% since the 70s. And yes, this is obviously quite devastating, and again, something that I'm sure is not new at all to you guys and your members. Similarly, you look at something like cooperatives, which was a way that farmers historically could counteract these powerful concentrated industries to build their power in cooperatives. But even cooperatives today, that exist within a highly concentrated system can in turn, feel this pressure to get large themselves and merge and increasingly drift away from their original creation and their goal of supporting their members. And the dairy industry is a really pertinent example of this. I think it's no surprise to anyone that the dairy industry is in crisis right now. Independent dairy farmers are really struggling in Wisconsin, one of the largest milk-producing states. Lost over 40% of its dairy farms since 2004 at a rate of nearly 2 farms going out of business per day in 2018 alone. Since 2014, the price farmers receive for milk has fallen 40%, which is below a lot of most farmers' break-even points. A lot of this has to do with supply and oversupply, but it also has to do with farmers' power in the face of consolidated milk processing and co-ops that were co-op like Dairy Farmers of America, meant to help farmers who, milk is a very perishable product, as are a lot of livestock. You have a limited window in which you can move this product, and cooperatives were supposed to advocate for farmers to make sure that they can get a better price. But increasingly, as co-ops have had to deal with very powerful processors, they're more siding with the processors than with their farmer members. Dairy Farmers of America, for instance, has grown to the point where it owns many parts of the supply chain. It has its own milk trucking, milk processing, and this creates an obvious conflict of interest because the less DFA can pay for milk, then the more DFA can make in the other parts of its processing business. And so according to DFA's 2016 financial statements, about 60% of DFA's net income was coming from these non-member business earnings, so everything offside the milk sales. So that 60% of their income was all these other industries that rely on cheap milk. And none of those earnings, were being shared with members. One person's gone as far to say as the management of DFA is consistently working against its rank and file members, and yet DFA is very large. They control 30% of the milk supply, and in many regions they're the only co-op that farmers have to work with, and this gives them a lot of price-setting power, to the point where farmers had to go as far as seeking private action in class action lawsuits to receive compensation for price setting against the co-op that they technically own. It's a very challenging and distressing example of what can happen when industries try to work within these very concentrated systems. And I think a lot of this concentration really starts at the end of the chain. A lot of what I'm talking about has been power and building power vis-a-vis different entities. And when you have very consolidated retail markets, then there is a pressure on everyone else to bulk up. This is something that we say at open markets, monopoly begets more monopoly. And oftentimes, large processors have a pressure to consolidate in order to negotiate with someone like Walmart, which sells 1 in 4 groceries across the United States. And what's interesting about Walmart is it shows another important side of antitrust enforcement, because Walmart didn't get to its dominance by acquisition. If you were to change merger law, or merger enforcement rather, that wouldn't have prevented the rise of something like Walmart. They didn't get here from buying other companies. They got here from anti-competitive practices, notably predatory pricing. They can leverage their size to drive out other competitors by selling at a loss. So this recent research by the Institute of Local Self-Reliance shows that in 1 out of every 10 metropolitan areas across the United States and 1 out of every 3 micropolitan areas, Walmart sells half or more of all groceries. And they were able to drive out competitors because a Walmart store can sell at a loss indefinitely. They have the backing of Wall Street and then also the size of their other stores to lose money, sell below cost until their competitors are out of business. And it doesn't matter if a local store has more customers or is more competitive and is the preferred store. At the end of the day, that local store doesn't have Wall Street. They need to pay their bills. They can't lose money indefinitely, and so they lose every time just because they're small. And this is an issue because as a retailer becomes powerful or more large, they have what we call monopoly power, which means a market in which there are very few buyers. And when you have a large reliance on one buyer, you have to take whatever they offer because you can't afford to lose that market. So we have this chart on the left of your screen. It goes through some majorly powerful companies. You would think that Del Monte Foods was a very powerful company, or you would think that General Mills had a lot of power, but General Mills relies on 20% of their sales with Walmart. 20% of their sales are with Walmart. Or Del Monte, 34% of their sales are with Walmart. And so they have to accept the whatever deal Walmart offers them. They can push down their prices. And that cost cutting comes from the least powerful people along the chain. It comes out of the pockets of farmers and workers. So we look at the changing share of the consumer dollar, and you can see this very clearly. In the 90s, before Walmart started selling groceries, ranchers received almost 60 cents of every dollar spent on beef. The retailers were taking about a third, 33 cents of every dollar spent on beef. Just in 2009, after Walmart had really grown its market share, the consumer share of the beef dollar went down. Farmers only received 42 cents on every dollar, and the retailer share had almost gone up to 50 cents. Same in pork. The change in farmer share of the dollar went from 45 cents to 25 cents, while the retailer share grew from 45 cents to 61 cents. And also the packer share grew, which sort of shows, again, that vertical integration and shift to contract farming that happened in pork. The packer share went up from 10 cents to 14 cents. And so this shows the importance of working on things like predatory pricing. That is another way people can use the bulk power of their size to really squish everyone along the supply chain. And there have been more studies that reinforce this. There was a recent economic study that showed companies that have this greater level of what's called revenue reliance on one buyer had lower wages over time, and that the longer that a company had this revenue reliance on one or two buyers, and the bigger that revenue reliance was directly correlated with either decreases in their workers' wages or failure of their wages to grow. So this affects farmers, but it also affects people working in food processing, people working in food shipping, really all parts of the supply chain. So again, this is concerning, but I guess that leaves the question, what can we do? I think open markets and OCM are proud to work together as a part of this broader movement working to change antitrust enforcement across the entire economy. And at least I have been heartened to see that food and farming has been a really prevalent topic. Obviously, there's a lot of talk about big tech, but I think food and farming is an issue in which these issues of monopoly power are very egregious, and I think there's a lot of interest in working on that area. You see things like the merger moratorium bill that's been introduced for proposing to halt all ag mergers until a way to address the market power in this industry is figured out. We've also seen some presidential candidates talk about this, but also lawmakers from across the aisle are increasingly interested in reinvigorating antitrust. And there are laws on the books that we can revisit. In a lot of instances, this is a question of enforcement. How can we change the culture at places like the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice to take more risks, to try more cases, but then also thinking about how can we change the way judges think about this issue to reinterpret the laws. Perhaps that will take, a law directing agencies to interpret these laws differently. But I think there's also a bigger ideological shift afoot that, more and more law students are, interested in thinking about this issue differently. We also see, as I mentioned, in the case of meat packers, these private suits, so private class action lawsuits that are really being bold and taking on some of this anti-competitive behavior. So we talked a lot about food today, but open markets, I'm really excited to be a part of a team that's working on all sorts of these issues in all different parts of the economy, from how tech monopolies like Google and Facebook affect the viability of the free press, local newspapers, the diversity of journalism, to healthcare, which I mentioned before, and also how this affects things like our transportation infrastructure and, again, the labor economy, how a lot of these, issues like monopoly power affect workers. We do all different kinds of work around this, publish newsletters like Food and Power, which comes out every other week. A lot of journalistic work, doing investigative stories in magazines to try and spread the word, bring this issue to light, but also doing research, policy research, trying to come up with the solutions. How do we figure out how to reinforce these laws? And then working on advocacy, how can we get more people to take up this issue. And we also do a bit of legal work, submitting what are called amicus briefs in Supreme Court cases, advocating for judges to consider, the other side of this antitrust equation. And we've actually, through our letters and amicus briefs, for instance, there was a pretty niche merger in the printing industry of, the prints like large magazines and books, that, the two largest companies were going to merge, and it would have created a monopoly, and it was kind of going under the wire. And we submitted a letter in that case, and obviously, who knows why mergers get blocked, but the merger was blocked, and I would like to think that we had a part in that. And so, really working to sound the alarm and try and stop and reverse some of this consolidation. And so with that, I think we have still a lot of time for questions, and thank you all for listening today.
Thanks, Claire, for this great presentation. I think it always helps to hear how we got here, and like Joe likes saying, big doesn't just happen, and there's a whole history behind how we got to the consolidation that we have today. And it's also nice to hear some stats from areas outside of agriculture to see that it's a wider problem. It's not just one that we're facing farm and food. What I'd like to do now is to open it up to questions. What I'm going to do is unmute everyone. If you have a question, either just throw it out there or put it in the chat box.
Well, this is Barbara Ross, and thank you so much, Claire, for that really fine presentation. I guess as I listen and as I've studied this and dealt with it over many years, and I see the good work OCM does and is trying to do, and other organizations as well. It just seems like we keep slipping further behind in spite of all this good work. And I just wonder about your thoughts about that. I often feel discouraged. I was listening to a program yesterday about the effects of, you know, all these ag chemical companies. They push out all this stuff which harms farmers that are trying to raise maybe not the crop that they want, that, you know, Monsanto or now Bayer wants us to raise. But they were talking to a honey farmer down in Arkansas, and the immense destruction it has done to his 10,000 honeybee hives farm. And you know, there's no bringing these people to heel. You know, they're just stuck. And here's a little farmer, little in the scope of things, but that was their livelihood for 3 generations. And now, because of the effects of dicamba on the honeybees, because of what the honeybees have to eat in order to produce honey, it's destroying them. Well, that's just like one anecdotal story about how this all affected. And I just think, seems like we just slip further behind, and these big corporations that sell all of these horrible products that are doing us in cannot be brought to heel. They do this with impunity, and increasingly it seems like that. And it doesn't matter, like, and nobody talks about it on the news. You talk about consolidation in media. The media never talks in any substantive way, particularly the big commercial media. You never hear this. This was not a commercial radio station I was listening to, a little community radio station where they're having this discussion. I just sometimes feel, you know, great angst over it all, and even anger at times, because I feel like we're slipping behind, and things are slipping away, and we're not going to have any kind of a democracy whatsoever, or maybe not any kind of a world left if it's left to these big corporate interests. Someplace in there's some questions.
Yeah, I mean, no, absolutely. The stakes are massive, right? Like, this really gets down to your point, fundamental questions about democracy, because another thing we look at open markets is consolidated power. You know, it not only comes with economic power, the ability to manipulate markets, but, you know, perhaps just as importantly comes with increased political power. And that's definitely a massive thing that we have to contend with and shouldn't be underestimated. These corporations do have incredible political power. And yeah, I think what at least gives me some hope, because, you know, we have to have hope, is that we have, you know, faced this powerful political power before, and it was led by, you know, grassroots movement, again, of farmers and workers. And I think change can sometimes happen quickly, just as we saw, for instance, Bork's way of interpreting antitrust laws, you know, at first when it was introduced seemed very radical. It was quite a dramatic departure from antitrust enforcement at the time, and it really pretty rapidly took over to become consensus. Now, granted, that viewpoint was on the side of power, which obviously helped its spread, but it also showed me that some of these doctrines or things that seem, you know, embedded in the courts or the way we think about things, you know, can change dramatically. And I guess, you know, we just have to hope that people become more interested. I think, you know, antitrust can seem very wonky, but I think it gets down to fundamental questions of, again, who has a voice. And yeah, I guess we just have to have hope that people come together and say, this is what we want. I don't know, I do feel like something could change, and I think we are seeing things begin to change, but to your point, we should not at all underestimate the power of people who don't want this to change. And it's definitely a serious fight.
Well, certainly I agree that for people of conscience, to engage in the struggle is extremely important. You know, you have to either live what you believe, or you're just a fundamentally unhappy and untruthful person. But still, the reality remains of how difficult this is. And I guess because I see it having happened right now with the current political structure that we're operating under, it just is just spilling out the sides day after day, all of the deregulation and all the damage that's being done. But I see it under under both Democrat and Republican administrations, and at all levels, at the state and at the federal level, and even at local levels, these things happening. So it can be very disheartening, and you don't know where to try to stick your finger in the hole, you know, the leaky hole first. But thank you for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Hi.
I have a question too. Hi, I'm Danielle. I work for Equal Exchange, and we love OCM and everything they do. And this is a really great presentation, so thanks so much. I'm thinking of a way, because like I often do presentations where we're in front of consumers, and my question might be, can you hear me? Okay.
Yep.
Okay. And my question is kind of geared towards like, sometimes I think this intersects with culture. Like I think what companies are also doing is like they're really like infusing this culture of convenience and ease, and like that consumers don't have to do any work. You don't have to think, you don't have to do work, you just show up, right? And like, you know, what we've been kind of doing is using this term like citizen consumer, and it's like actually saying the opposite, right? Like, no, we actually like need you to stand, like how Barbara was saying, like stand by your beliefs, like with what you're buying, your individual behaviors, because that actually matters, right? Even though it seems like it's just one person, if that becomes aggregate, then it's a pattern, and folks have to listen to us because we won't buy their products. But then that's actually not enough. So like a lot of the bills that, you know, the merger moratorium are super important as well. Like, how do we get like folks to like understand this really like dense information in like a quick and easy way? And like, I don't know, I feel like you've probably done a lot of these presentations, and like, you know, obviously this is like a niche group who has like a lot of knowledge, and like I'm like loving all these charts. I'm like, oh, I could use this, maybe get my hands on that chart, or, you know, we love the Walmart one, and have been like taking a look at using different charts. But I don't know if there's like, if you've learned anything about maybe like, has your audience ever been like kind of like the average person, and like how do you get them to like grasp some of like this really kind of heavy stuff?
Definitely, yeah. It's definitely hard when, you know, there are sort of multiple stages of how people learn about these issues. You know, one is just learning about the issues that exist in the first place, right? A lot of people are fairly unconscious consumers. And then, you know, sort of I think the next step does tend to be a lot of the conscious consumerism step. But I think, you know, ultimately you have to be looking at systemic issues because, you know, take, for instance, there has been really, you know, even when there is a mass consumer movement to ask for something different, look at processed foods. There's been a huge change in people being uncomfortable with the power that these large processed food companies have, the amount of sugar they're putting in products. You know, pretty much universally people aren't happy with that, and they've been asking for healthier foods. Yet, at the same time, you know, you see companies then just acquiring these, you know, nascent small food startups. And so you can have consumer preferences change, but the power dynamics not change, because we still have these large companies owning just whatever is the new product that people demand. And so I think one way to, I guess, think about it in a, you know, not wonky, like straightforward way is, you know, looking at the rules of the game, right? Like what we're talking about is, you know, not just changing what people want, but changing what companies are allowed to do. And that, you know, consumers in some ways shouldn't have, I mean, yes, like there is something to be a conscious consumer, and I do think that's important, but also it's hard for people to make all these choices, and as you know, there are some people who can't afford to make these choices, and they, you could say, why should people be put in these situations in the first place? Companies should, have better rules to just be better participants in our shared society. And so that's one way I try to think about it, is focusing on, government structure markets. I think you have to break through some of this idea that these markets have these free natural forces. They don't. They're, they exist because governments, created the rules of the game. And right now the rules are far too permissive for companies to externalize a lot of these costs. I think externalized costs is like another way to talk about this when we think about especially things like really cheap food, because that's often, how the consumer welfare standard works and how a lot of these issues are phrased, like food is quote-unquote cheap. Or even something like Facebook or Amazon. Their services are free, right? But, the destruction of democracy is a pretty big cost, or the loss of small businesses is a really big cost. It's like looking at, I think externalized costs is a kind of a quick way to talk about these issues, and then again, thinking about how can we set fair market rules so that people are more on equal footing. And then again, talking about it in terms of who has power, who doesn't have power, I think that's also pretty innate for most consumers to understand. Like, consumers have a certain amount of power in aggregate, but ultimately they can only purchase what is available in the market, and when the market is structured in a way in which products they want are very difficult to find, then it also comes down to who's in the market. I don't know if any of that is helpful at all. If you have any other follow-up questions with that.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with like everything you've been saying too, and it's like I think that in the absence of like government stepping in is probably why the kind of conscious consumerism became more popular, right? And then like at the same time, folks are constituents of this country. Like, this is like our shared planet. This is like our economy. These are our local economies. But it just feels so hard because it's like really interwoven with culture. And I'm really interested in that piece as well, because it's like you have less human connection. Like, you used to go down to the store and like know your farmer and like, hey, I'm picking up like something from the farm stand. I think there are a lot of folks that I think are interested in like returning to that. But it's like, at the same time, Amazon is really convenient. I work this many hours a week. I don't have that much money. I can buy this thing for $5. I don't have to leave my house. I don't have to like drive there and waste my gas. Like, so it's like, it's so hard because it's like also there's this like cultural aspect that's like, in some ways I think it's like moving away from like local economies too. I don't know if that is true or not. It feels that way, but.
No, definitely. That is a really hard question. I think a lot of this is tied to like culture and civics. Like, you even see small towns or small towns that have more locally owned businesses have higher levels of civic engagement, higher levels of voting, more engagement in the civic process. And I think decentralized economies are also a facet of the ways people feel connected to one another and engage. And I think this is sort of a bigger existential issue across a lot of things, growing, social isolation and disconnection that I do think is tied to monopoly, tied to, a decline of local journalism, a rise of Facebook. I think, part of it relates to decentralizing the economy. Right, and so then again, I think part of it comes back to, there does have to be enforcement. Like, you can't entirely change this in a vacuum, but then, how do you address this bigger reliance on convenience? And I guess I want to think that localized economies could still potentially provide some of, the services that people like today. Like technology doesn't have to be only used by the powerful. I think there are ways to get creative about how people access things like local food. I think I used to work in institutional food purchasing for a Bon Appetit management company, and looking at things like schools. Like that's a way where, the consumers aren't really thinking about how they're getting their food at school. Like obviously it's work on the school's part to go away from sort of, preheated, frozen, reheated food toward more scratch cooking. But, in a competitive market where you have people demanding different things and a business can grow like Bon Appetit that is offering a different type of food service, and they've been very successful offering this different model. And, it's a way where the consumer doesn't necessarily change their behavior, but, they're getting better product. The company is changing their behavior. And so I don't have, the answers of how do these small businesses compete with stuff showing up at your door at 2 days. But at the very least, I think you have to regulate those services. Or you think about something like, even if you say Amazon network is, a service in and of itself. You think about its massive platform, its massive distribution system as something that people, small businesses, deserve access to. It's like a platform through which people can get things. What if just small players weren't crushed by Amazon when they used their platform, or if Amazon's platform was neutral? This is something that we call common carriage laws. It was what was used with railroads, for instance. Railroads provide an essential service. You need the railroad to get places. You get to a point where horse and buggies just can't compete with the railroad anymore. But their service being essential needs to be neutral. It needs to serve all people and all players. And it can't, use its sort of double vested interest to suppress competition. Yeah, so I guess that's another way of thinking about things that are what we call natural monopolies, things like telecom, big industries that doesn't necessarily make sense to have a lot of small players. So how do you regulate them so they're fair and open? Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. I definitely agree with that. I just think a lot about too, how does an individual behavior and how does that translate into a system or a pattern? And something I think that is different that smaller companies just do way better than larger companies is that human connection, so even thinking about a small credit union, I had Citizens Bank, and the idea was cool, it's more convenient, and they offer all these services, and there was an instance of fraud where someone took all my money out of my account, and they didn't care, they didn't help me. And so I was F this, I'm going to this small credit union, and it really is inconvenient. It's further away from me, I have to drive, and but it's they care about me. If something happened, they would help me. They know who I am. I go in there and I talk to the lady, and she we know each other's first name now, right? So I think that that's something that Amazon just doesn't have, and I think people want that now. You have such a digital age, people do want that human connection. I think that's my optimistic point of view.
Smaller businesses are de facto, clunkier or less efficient or worse, and that's not true. There's a lot of cases in which small businesses are more efficient, are better, more resilient. I think resiliency is a good way to frame this. How do we want our systems to be? Something a large concentrated bank that is very risky. That's not good. Small systems can have a lot of benefits. I think too often, they're sort of cornered as, oh, they can't compete. It's no, there are reasons they can't compete. They're at a structural disadvantage. They could be more convenient. They could provide these more services. They could be better competitors if given the opportunity. Yeah, and so I think really focusing on what small businesses or decentralized economies do well instead of, this culture of always focusing on efficiency and convenience that I think really comes from, a nascent, sort of free market like ideology you're trying to, that primarily benefits the most powerful. Yeah. I know we're coming up on time. I don't know if you have a follow-up or are there any other questions?
I just want to make sure other people want to stay on. So.
Yeah.
Did we have any other questions? Doesn't sound like anyone else has a question. We're coming up on time, so thank you very much for the webinar today, Claire. And yeah, we hope to see you at the next Ag Justice webinar, which will be in a couple months. Look out for emails about it. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Will you be at the conference?
Yes, hope to see if anyone at the call is going to be in Kansas City next week. I'll be there and hope to meet you all.
Yeah, I'll be there. I'll see you.
Okay, great.
All right.
Awesome.
Bye. Bye, Catherine.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks again.